this. I mean, advertising is a massive industry. It is almost $750 billion now. That's, almost 3 times as much as Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk combined are worth. So it's a pretty big industry. And we have an enormous impact on the world through advertising and social media. Social media has had just tremendous impact, and I think it's really entered into the mainstream consciousness in a major way in the last 5 years or so. If you go back and look at Arab Spring, the democratic movement that flowered as a result of social media, enormous positive impact. If you look at what happened in Myanmar, kind of enormous negative impact. So what we really wanted to do was just have a conversation with one of the leading experts on social media. We've seen recently, domestic political violence. We've seen economic disruption as crowds have gotten together and pumped up stocks and done things we never could imagine years ago. All these things are predicted and more in the book of Sinan Aral, who I'm about to introduce. And before I introduce Sinan, I want to do just a quick test on how powerful social media is and how quickly memes and ideas spread on social media. So there's a chat button on the bottom of your screen. If you recognize the phrase I'm about to use, just type into the chat box meow. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that itself is an experiment. So I'm going to say to you something that entered the consciousness yesterday, and it's as simple as this: I am not a cat. Now, if anybody knows what I'm talking about when I say I am not a cat, just hit the chat. I'm seeing meows, meows. So for those of you who don't, there they come. Yes, they're coming very quickly. So for those of you who don't know, a lawyer had his cat filter on his Zoom call yesterday and appeared at a court hearing as a cat and couldn't figure out how to turn it off. And that simple, funny meme spread around the world in less than 24 hours to the point where more than half of you, in a question I asked 30 seconds ago, recognized the meme. And that tells you how powerful this new force called social media is. So I'm really proud to introduce Sinan and to do this fireside chat. I've known Sinan for years. I would consider him the world's foremost expert on social media. And I think he's widely considered that, the world's foremost researcher in this area. He identifies as a number of identities. First, as a scientist and researcher. Second, as an entrepreneur. And third, as an investor. He's actually started a venture capital fund. He is a professor at MIT and director of the renowned Initiative on the Digital Economy, which really helps organizations digitize and look at the impact of digital on their entire operations. He also is director of the Social Analytics Lab, and I'm privileged to judge the data science competition with Sinan once a year in that Social Analytics Lab. His PhD is from the London School of Economics. Master's from London School of Economics, PhD from MIT. And he describes himself, and I would wholeheartedly concur, as a data nerd. I would add brilliant data nerd in there, and one of the smartest people I know on social media. He's the author of The Hype Machine. The Hype Machine came out last September. For any of you interested in the future of democracy, the future of the economy, the future of vaccination and COVID, and indeed the future of the world for our children, I would highly urge you to read the book. Because it's really, in my view, the leading futurist, rigorous work on what social media has already done and what's it doing. And for all of us who spend money on advertising social media, we have to ask ourselves every now and then, are we doing good supporting these networks? Are we not doing good? What should our positions be as people who control nearly $750 billion globally in thinking about social media as a force for good? So let's start at the beginning. Sinan, you've been researching social media for 20 years. Take us back 20 years. What got you interested in social media 2 decades ago?
Yeah, it's funny because I was, at the time that I started researching social media, people did not really understand why I was going in that direction. I did get a number of comments of people giving me a career advice, basically saying, I think you're really wasting your time. This is going to sort of tank your academic career. Why don't you focus on technology that's going to be more impactful in the world? And I said, I don't know. I think this could actually be very impactful in the world. And really, the way it started for me was that I remember I was a graduate student at MIT. I was taking 2 classes at the same time. One was from the renowned statistician Jerry Hausman in the economics department at the PhD level. And in that class, we we studied a bunch of models called blue models, the best linear unbiased estimators. And all of those models assumed that the observations in our data were independent of one another. And I was taking a class from the then rising star of sociology, Ezra Zuckerman, who later became the dean of the faculty at the Sloan School at MIT. And in that class, we were studying social networks and how everyone and everything in business, society, and in general was so interdependent. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, there's a real disconnect here between our economic models of the marketplace and the messy reality of the interdependence that really does exist. And so I started studying online networks, which at the time were email networks and text messaging networks and online forums where people were sending messages to each other and in different networked forums and so on. And the most nascent platforms that provided online digital networking were platforms like Friendster and MySpace, and later followed by Facebook and so on. And I thought to myself, you know, there's a real opportunity here to understand how interdependence and the ability to sort of message each other at scale is going to kind of transform society, because it's not the internet. It's not like the telephone. It's algorithmically driven, scaled mass interdependence. It's kind of like the central nervous system of humanity was built in the last 10 years in a way that we could have never imagined before social media. And so when I started studying it, you know, I thought this is going to be absolutely transformative. And people were saying to me, why would you want to study, you know, a silly, technology that's all about cat memes and, you know, pictures of chihuahuas that look like blueberry muffins? And I said, no, I really think this could have profound effects on our democracy and our economy and our public health. And now the chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak.
So why don't you give us an example of both sides? I talked about Arab Spring, I talked about Myanmar, but your book talks a lot about the promise and the peril of social media. And it reminds me of back in the days of the Manhattan Project, you know, where there was sort of massive promise, but massive peril about nuclear weapons. Give an example for folks about what you mean by the promise of social media and what you mean by the peril of social media.
Yeah, perfect. So I think that it's pretty clear now, although it wasn't a year ago to most people, the potential for the peril, right? So in the book, I actually predicted the Capitol riots. I actually, you know, I didn't say there'd be a Capitol riot on January 6th, but I said that I believe what's going to happen is that the election is going to be contested, and this is going to escalate to violence because of the spread of misinformation on social media, which is exactly what happened on the 6th. Also described something akin to the GameStop stock price movements, with multiple examples of stock price manipulations in 2014, 2013. Both in cases of kind of pump and dump stock schemes that were investigated by the SEC, but also in the case of the hack crash of 2013, where Syrian hackers got hold of the AP Twitter news handle and put out a tweet that said Barack Obama had been injured or killed in an explosion in the White House. And because social media sentiment is tied to machine learning systems that are sensing the sentiment on social media and triggering automated trading algorithms, that one tweet, when it went viral, it wiped out $140 billion in equity value in a matter of minutes. And so those are two examples of the peril. And the third was in my book, you know, the subtitle of the book is how it disrupts our elections, our economy, and our public health. And so the two predictions about elections and economy are about the Capitol riot and about GameStop. But the third prediction is about the potential disruption in our ability to control the coronavirus pandemic. And what we see now is that just about 10 days ago, because of misinformation around vaccines, Dodger Stadium was shut down in LA by anti-vax protesters. And now we see Instagram banning Robert Kennedy for spreading vaccine misinformation. This was also entirely predictable because in 2019, it was measles, not coronavirus, where we saw a resurgence in measles, 1,800% increase. Measles was eradicated in the US in the year 2000. In 2010, there were only 63 cases. Now there was a resurgence in 2019, primarily because of vaccine misinformation spreading through Facebook ad buys in communities like Rockland County, New York, and Clark County, Washington, where vaccine hesitancy drops below the threshold needed for herd immunity, and diseases like measles and pandemics like the coronavirus are allowed to spread because people refuse to take vaccines. So those are sort of the three major examples of the peril. And there are other examples in the book, but the promise is now often forgotten, where for a while we couldn't see the peril until it kind of really became apparent in the last, I would say, 6 months to a year. I think that now we're almost forgetting the promise. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. So when Nepal had the greatest earthquake that it's seen in the last 100 years, Europe and the United States donated about $10 million, or I think US donated $10 million to relief efforts, and the European Union donated about $3 million. And Facebook spun up a donate now button and raised 15.5 million, more than Europe and the US combined, for relief efforts from 770,000 individual donors from 140 plus countries, which just goes to show the mobilizing power of social media to deliver life-saving relief aid at a time greater than both the Europe and the United States combined. People like to make fun, for instance, of the ice bucket challenge, but it's hard to laugh at $250 million raised for ALS research in 8 weeks from a social media meme. That's quite powerful. Social movements, as you described, are another great example. You talked about the Arab Spring, but the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement say there would be no Black Lives Matter movement without social media. It's essential to the mobilization, legitimization, and coordination of progressive social movements in the modern day. In the book, I describe the power and the fragility of those social movements because they rise very rapidly, but frequently in a social media age, those types of social media catalyzed movements are leaderless. Sometimes they don't have systematic demands that they try to enact. Sometimes they don't have the organization that sustains real change. And so I go into the complex, nature of the power and the fragility of those social movements. But those are examples. Another great example is that research that we've done at the MIT IDE and that has been done at Stanford estimates that Facebook creates $370 billion in consumer surplus every year in the United States alone, and that's just in the U.S. And the U.S. is a very small fraction of Facebook's global audience, and in some countries, Facebook is the internet, like in the Philippines and in parts of Africa. Facebook is the internet, and the way it generates that value for consumers is that it is a place to find jobs, to educate oneself, to do reskilling, to change one's career. People run small and medium-sized businesses exclusively over Facebook. That's where we go for life-saving health information, for meaningful human connection. And if Facebook generates $370 billion in consumer surplus in the U.S., imagine that worldwide. It's about running our businesses. It's about finding jobs. It's about life-saving health information and so on. So in the book, I detail a number of examples of both the promise and the peril. And I think the question before us now is, we've seen the tremendous peril that social media can create. We know the tremendous promise that it also holds. The question now is, how do we achieve the promise and avoid the peril, what can we concretely do to solve the social media crisis that we find ourselves in?
Absolutely. And there's layers to that question. There's legislative, there's sort of self-governing, certainly as advertisers and marketers who are really our audience here, their dollars really feed the ecosystem of social media, and their values really feed what comes through on those feeds and these machine curated feeds that everyone gets. We had a researcher in the UK, and Michael Lewis, the writer, approached us in March of last year, where at ViralGains, and there was a symptom of COVID that no one knew about. It was pre-publication. The articles had been submitted, but it took 3-4 weeks for peer review. And that symptom is loss of sense of taste and smell. And at the time, no one knew about that. Everyone was looking at fever and taking temperatures. So working with a bunch of very generous advertising partners and TikTok and others, we got 15 million people to watch dances and songs and messages and ads. And within weeks, that was added to the CDC list. It was added to the WHO list. And now, if you ask someone what's the number one thing they should do to see if they might have COVID, they'll all smell their coffee. And that was basically social media that did that. So I agree with you, the power and the peril are great. Let's talk a little bit about the medium within social media. So you say in your book that people remember about 10% of what they read, but about 95% of what they see on video. Video is such a compelling medium for storytelling, but it's also a compelling medium for misinformation. So how do you think video is going to evolve on social media?
Well, first of all, I think that video is the next era of content and sort of content creation, both in advertising and in general. I think that it's clear that video is beginning to replace textual content, both in terms of ads and in terms of sort of organic content. I think it is more effective than textual content, and I just think that it's more engaging. It's more, efficacious. It's more interesting, and for all those reasons, I think it is going to continue to displace textual content. And I think that it opens up a whole new world for publishers, for content providers, for advertisers, and so on. And I think that brands have to be really aware of the role of video going forward. It also changes the nature of content creation and content optimization. I think that understanding how video relates to engagement, persuasion, other types of KPIs is really important. And I think that brands and advertisers that are going to be successful in the future have to really get a handle on how video works, how we can measure how effective video is, and how we can change our content creation process to prioritize video and to become systematic in how we approach the creation and deployment of video as content.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When advertisers first started deploying online video, they thought of it as television on the internet, and they would simply repurpose the television ads. And you're now seeing much more interactivity, two-way conversation, variations based on who the person is and what they're interested in. And I agree with you. I think it's very much at the beginning. One of the things you said in a great article in Science Magazine, you did a very rigorous study, which you have to do to get into science or nature. Those are the top tier for those of you not in academia. And you showed that fake news, misinformation, spread 6 times faster than true information. That's a scary statistic. Can you talk a little bit about that research and what you concluded from reaching that conclusion?
Yeah, so we did a 10-year study with Twitter where we had access to the historical archive of Twitter, which isn't something that is publicly available. So we worked with Twitter to get that access. And we studied all of the verified true and false news articles that ever spread on Twitter in those 10 years. And you're right, what we found was that the verified false news traveled farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied. and it was most viral in the political category. And we were really curious as to, that's a shocking result. That result has been sort of stated time and again. It was, in Sacha Baron Cohen's comments to the Anti-Defamation League, where he called social media the greatest propaganda machine in history. It was in the Social Dilemma movie and so on. But for us, it was also interesting to ask then why. Like, why is it that false news travels so much farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth? And the first, gut hypothesis that we had was that, well, maybe false news spreaders have more followers, or maybe they follow more people, or maybe they're more often verified users of Twitter, or have been on Twitter longer, or tweet more often. And we checked each one of these in turn, and what we found was that the opposite was true in every case, that actually the false news spreaders had fewer followers, followed fewer people, were less often verified, and so on. So we had to seek a different explanation for why false news was so viral. And what we found by analyzing the content of the false news tweets and by looking at the reactions people had in reply to true and false news was that false news was more novel, more surprising, shocking, and emotional. It was anger inducing, blood boiling. So it's sort of the shock and awe, the shock and blood boiling nature of false news that is correlated with our likelihood of, in a knee-jerk way, retweeting it. So false news tweets are 70% more likely to be retweeted than the true ones, and they are much more novel. And in reply to these false news tweets, people express shock, surprise, disgust, anger, and so on.
Yeah, it's a really challenging issue. I can think of one way in which it's being used by advertisers in a more positive way. I recently saw a GM ad that they had run on the Super Bowl and launched digitally first with Will Ferrell and Kenan Thompson and Aquafina. And the ad is hilarious. He basically talks about GM, moving into EVs and competing with Norway. It's sort of like the South Park, Canada theme. And what I loved about the ad is it was shocking that it was a GM ad. So if you think of GM as Roger and me and gas guzzlers and never quite getting with the program and not being an innovator, you suddenly saw that ad and said, wait a minute, this is not your father's GM. So I find it really interesting when advertisers pull out the positive side of what you're citing, which is the ability to surprise and play with their brand and have fun. You see this on, Wendy's Twitter account. You see this in ads that shock, surprise, and delight. Colin Kaepernick with Nike, putting values foremost. So I'm seeing the opportunity to take the lessons of why misinformation spreads and use it to spread good things and things that change perception. Talk a little bit about the pandemic. So, two of your predictions have come to pass in a big way. Certainly the violence politically, certainly the economic disruption and, game stonks and all of that stuff. You talked about the closing down of the vaccination on the West Coast. What do you think we'll see between now and vaccination herd immunity, hopefully in August, September? How bad do you think it's going to get?
Well, I think that we have an opportunity to, in real time, try to realize the promise and avoid the peril of social media. I think that the idea that misinformation about the coronavirus vaccines will create vaccine hesitancy, enough of it to slow down our ability to stop the spread of the virus, is important, and we have to be cognizant of it and address it. But we also have an opportunity to spread information that would encourage people to take vaccines and to help us get out of the pandemic. So we just recently finished a paper that we put out the day before yesterday, which shows that essentially revealing to people descriptive norms about their community's willingness to take a vaccine increases their likelihood of taking the vaccine themselves, and that this is most true among people who underestimate the degree to which others in their community will take a vaccine. And so what that means to me is that, Dr. Anthony Fauci, for all of his amazing benefits, and I praise him quite highly, has been saying very loudly, I'm worried about vaccine hesitancy. I'm worried that people won't take the vaccine. I'm concerned that not enough people are going to take the vaccine, and so on. That kind of messaging that actually tells people, hey, there's a lot of hesitancy out there, people aren't going to take the vaccine, and so on, is counterproductive. When you survey people, you actually find that very large numbers of people are going to take the vaccine. And the more we spread that message, it's actually going to increase the likelihood that people will take the vaccine, especially amongst those who underestimate the degree to which others are going to take the vaccine. And this was in a large scale randomized experiment that we ran in a global survey that we've been doing at the IDE in collaboration with Facebook and the World Health Organization. And this was a randomized experiment among over 300,000 people. And so that kind of information that we can first glean by studying through social media, how people report, whether or not they'll take a vaccine, and how we can use messaging over social media, but also in the media and directly from public health experts to actually increase the likelihood of vaccines, is an example of the promise of social media to help us steer out of the pandemic. So you've got the peril in the misinformation creating vaccine hesitancy, and you've got the promise in scientifically understandable communication strategies that can statistically significantly increase vaccine acceptance, like the study that we just put out a day or two ago.
That's really interesting. It's oftentimes advertising has been used in kind of a mass way to get a message out. And the work you just cited reminds me a little bit of Nick Christakis's work, which, sort of pebbles in the pond where, you drop something in and the waves spread across the pond. And that work kind of got, popularly characterized as, if you're overweight, you hang out with other overweight people and you make them overweight. But in fact, it was about how birds of a feather flock together, which you've talked a lot about, and homophily, and finding people who are similar. So as we think about the advertising world, and you talk a lot in the book about ad personalization, you mentioned that personalized advertising and communication is 2 to 4 times more effective than non-personalized. You mentioned the concept of social proof, and you had some concepts around this phenomenon. Talk a little bit about how that works and why it works.
Yeah, so social proof is such an important concept that people have to understand. So one thing that is common to both the Capitol riot and the GameStop phenomenon is that social proof online both legitimizes, mobilizes, and sort of encourages people to participate in offline behaviors like those two incidents. And what I mean by social proof is the online display that others are in it with you, that others believe in this movement, that others are sharing screenshots of their investments in GameStop showing, hey, I've invested my money in this. Others saying, I like your content that says we're going to march on the Capitol, or I also will be there, et cetera. And so we've done very large scale experiments that show that social proof displayed in messaging on social media statistically significantly and meaningfully, in terms of the strength of the effect, increases the effectiveness of messaging on social media. So the degree to which we can display messages with social proof. And by the way, the vaccine result that I just described to you is another example of that, is just another example of social proof. Others, when you know that others are going to be vaccinated or will accept a vaccine, you're more likely to accept a vaccine. When you know that others are going to march on the Capitol with you, you're more likely to march on the Capitol. When you know that others are investing in GameStop, you're more likely to invest in GameStop. And so we can use this knowledge to be more effective in our social media messaging, and in terms of being more effective at creating the change we want to see in the world, like, for instance, getting everyone vaccinated for the coronavirus. So I think that this can be used to further altruism, it's been shown to statistically and meaningfully increase voting, to increase vaccinations, to increase all of those things that we want to encourage in society. The question again remains, what do we want to point this very powerful communication tool towards? Hopefully more towards the good and away from the bad.
One of the examples you use in the book that I find fascinating is the idea that human evolution itself is being affected by machine learning. If you think about dating applications by which many people meet these days, and in fact, there's a machine learning algorithm behind the scenes deciding who to show to you next. So our very evolution's being affected by machine learning, which is, pretty amazing. But machine learning also can affect at great scale personalization in advertising. And so how do you think about this idea that personalization, social proof, feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself, a very powerful tool, but how do you feel about the impact of machine learning in creating scale around personalization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that machine learning is a very powerful tool for deriving insights from large-scale data, and I think it can be used in a number of ways, and primarily in scaling our ability to apply insights from data to be more effective in online advertising, but in a number of other ways as well. And I think that it is being used more and more often. And I think that in the future, one thing that is going to dramatically increase the effectiveness of machine learning is recent calls for more and more transparency around the digital advertising ecosystem. And I describe this in my book as well, which is that, in a number of ways, digital advertising is currently more opaque than it should be. And as we start to see more transparency or calls for transparency, and we see, self-propagated reform on the part of the platforms, but also more calls for requirements for transparency. A lot of the data, I believe, is going to be become more available, and so machine learning is going to be even more useful than it is today. I think the sort of other side of that coin, however, is the debate about privacy. So we want to have transparency, and this is something that in an interview with the MIT Tech Review in 2018, I described as what I call the transparency paradox, which is that we're simultaneously asking in this industry for more transparency, but also more security.
Right.
And what do I mean by security? Well, transparency, we want the platforms to, open the kimono and reveal how the algorithms work and provide more data so we can be more effective and so on. But we're also saying, lock down consumers' data and don't reveal people's private information. And let's not forget that giving data to an academic institution for the purposes of research was what caused the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? And so I think what we're going to see is a continuation of the calls for more privacy and security and more transparency, and that the solutions that are going to be devised for that are going to be things like differential privacy, which is a statistical technique for revealing data in a way that doesn't reveal people's personal information, but provides individual level granular data for the purposes of being more effective at understanding sort of what's happening in the ecosystem.
I fundamentally agree with that, and I think there's a lot of interesting things coming in that area. I mean, what ViralGains does, we believe that privacy should be a right, and we instrument ads with questions and interactive experiences so that people tell us things like, am I likely to test drive a Nissan Versa, or is Pampers my favorite diaper brand, or am I likely to get vaccinated? And rather than following people around in sort of a creepy way as they go about their business and using that data, it's our view that understanding people by interacting with them and then using machine learning to generalize that is a better model. There's certainly changes coming in the traditional ways of advertising tracking, GDPR, cookieless, Chrome, IDFA in iOS 14. You cited in your book how in a paper by Catherine Tucker and Avi Goldfarb, ad effectiveness went down by 65% after GDPR went into effect. How can advertisers prevent this kind of decline with the future elimination of cookies without violating privacy? Where do you see that all going?
Well, I mean, I think that we have to get better at statistical estimation with less individual data. I also think that the platforms have to become more transparent, and advertisers have to demand more transparency around ad effectiveness so that they can measure it for themselves. Right. I think that these two moves have to happen simultaneously. I think that advertisers and the companies that support them that are good at making predictions about which targeting or which consumer is going to be interested in a particular ad, or which targeting is going to be effective without the use of cookies or other types of individual level data that in some instances is being phased out, are going to be more effective and have a competitive advantage in the future of this ecosystem. But I also believe that people are starting to understand that this opacity doesn't justify the tremendous amount of media spend that exists in this industry, and that also has to change. So I just, right before I got on this call, I led a session for the IDE seminar today with Tim Huang, who's the author of The Subprime Attention Crisis, which goes into detail about the opacity of the digital advertising industry and how that makes it really hard to measure the effectiveness of digital ads, and that somehow this has got to change. Otherwise, it foretells a potential backlash by advertisers and the ecosystem against a system where they don't get as much out of digital, or they don't understand the effectiveness of digital ads as much as they could in a way that is still privacy preserving. And I think that that's the real challenge for the industry moving forward, is how do we facilitate a detailed understanding of advertising effectiveness without compromising personal privacy? That challenge, I think businesses and brands and platforms that figure out the answers to that question are going to have a competitive advantage.
Yeah, it's changing pretty fast. And, you have a world where the large walled gardens kind of grade their own homework and don't let advertisers pull their data out. And in that same world, you have brands beginning to take more control over their own advertising. In the last year, driven in part by the pandemic, driven in part by changes in cookies, driven in part by the desire to integrate advertising and marketing, it's gone from 31% of brands who brought programmatic buying in-house to 69% in 1 year. So I think it's a symptom of what you're describing, which is brands really having a desire to own and control their own data. and not leave it to the walled gardens to say, no, no, it's working. We won't tell you why, but it's working. And it seems to be a very major trend driven by a number of things. Let's talk about regulation for a minute. Clearly, there's a regulatory regime coming. We'll certainly see antitrust hearings of various sorts in the next few years. I used to go down to Silicon Valley, to Washington, with a lot of CEOs talking about tech issues, and there was pretty much bipartisan agreement that tech was good and we needed to support it. And the world has changed as big tech has gotten very powerful. So what do you think is coming from a hearing and regulation perspective, and what do you think should come?
Yeah, so this is sort of the point of my book, which is that I love books like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff and Zucked by Roger McNamee and the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix. But the one shortcoming of all of those is that they don't really talk about solutions. They're all, calls, for the dangers of social media, but they don't really discuss what do we do. And so the point of my book sort of takes off where those books and movies leave off, which is to ask, what can we concretely do? And in my book, I describe 4 levers: money, code, norms, and laws, where money are the business models of the platforms, code is the design of the platforms and the algorithms, norms are how we use them, and laws are regulation. And when it comes to regulation, there are a number of questions. And the first entry ticket to solving the social media crisis, in my opinion, is to create competition. And when I say that, people immediately think, oh, you mean break up Facebook? But that's not what I advocate in the book, actually, because this economy, the social media economy, runs on network effects, and economies that run on network effects tend towards market concentration. So if you break up the market leader, it'll just tip the next Facebook-like company into market dominance. And breaking up Facebook doesn't solve the market failures that exist. Like, it doesn't do anything to solve misinformation or privacy violations or election manipulation or the line between
all that.
Yeah, or the line between free speech and harmful speech. Each of those is its own regulatory problem that deserves scrutiny. So I think that the way we create competition is actually very different. We need structural reforms of the social media economy itself, because breaking up Facebook is like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. It doesn't actually stop the underlying cause of the market concentration. But some reforms that would are interoperability legislation and data and social network portability legislation. And the analogies are, when it comes to interoperability, when we approved the AOL Time Warner merger, we forced AOL's AIM Instant Messenger to become interoperable with Yahoo Messenger and MSN Messenger, and it went from 65% market share to 59% 1 year later to 55% 2 years later. 3 years after those guidelines, it ceded the entire market to new entrants. That's how you create competition. Social network and data portability is analogous to cell phone number portability. It used to be you couldn't take your cell phone number with you, and at the time that was your social network because everyone knew to call you there. When we instituted number portability, it created tons of consumer surplus and competition. There's a study that shows that when Europe instituted cell phone number portability, it created $880 million of consumer surplus every quarter for years and years and years because of the competition it created. When we can vote with our feet and move from platform to platform with our data and our social networks, it forces them to respond to our market requests for better service, more privacy, less misinformation, less hate speech, and so on. Right now, they have no incentive because they're making profits hand over fist because there's not enough competition. Once we bring competition to this industry, we then need to address each of the market failures in turn: privacy, the spread of misinformation, election manipulation, the line between free and harmful speech. And I discuss each one of those in the book. Just to give you an example, like, we need federal privacy legislation in the United States. I believe we can learn from the pros and cons of the GDPR and design an even better federal privacy legislation in the US if we just consult the experts. And in the book, I call for a National Commission on Democracy and Technology to bring these opinions to bear. And when it comes to the line between free and harmful speech, that's really one of the major elements of that discussion is the reform or repeal of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And there I advocate that repeal is really a disaster for the free internet as we know it. It's not a solution, but there can be meaningful reforms to Section 230. I just think that The best places to do that are not 5-person politically appointed commissions like the FTC or the FCC,
Right.
but in the most deliberative representative bodies that we have, like Congress and through case law in the courts.
Yeah, and it's an interesting problem because on the one hand, Section 230 says, if you're a platform, you're not a publisher, and therefore you're not liable for what's published. At the same time, when you have machine learning algorithms that determine what gets seen, it gets hard to argue you're not a publisher. So there's certainly really interesting issues and they get part of that. So I'm going to summarize a quote from the book with my last question, and we'll pull a few from the audience. You said that social media platforms blame lack of regulation for their issues, that governments blame social media platforms for turning a blind eye to their impact, that people blame government and social media for inaction, but that we all have a responsibility in social media's direction. So for our audience here of advertisers and marketers, how do we take responsibility for our role in the hype machine, and what can advertisers do?
Well, first of all, I think we have to continue to put pressure on the platforms for self-regulation through movements like the Delete Facebook movement and the Stop Hate for Profit movement. I think we have to be cognizant of the messaging that we put in our own advertisements so that it does no harm, in essence, that it's truthful and so on. That we have to be very cognizant of consumers' privacy. And I think that as users, we have to be diligent and aware of the type of information that we're sharing. In the book, I discuss sort of how citizens can be more informed and more active in promoting a healthy communications ecosystem. And so I think that all three of these stakeholders, what I call the platforms, the policymakers, and the people, all have a role to play in solving the social media crisis that we find ourselves in.
That's a phenomenal way, I think, to end this part. Kelsey, did you have some questions you wanted to ask that came from our viewers here?
Yes. So the first one being from Justin, kind of going back to social media regulation of sorts. It's kind of in the same vein of that. But Sinan would love to know your perspective on how much responsibility the Twitters, Facebooks, Instagrams, et cetera, should have in censoring content, given the speed at which fake news can travel.
Well, I'm a huge fan of the First Amendment. I believe it's a cornerstone of democracy. I believe that it's essential to the marketplace of ideas that stimulates innovation. But you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. I think that there are existence proofs of harmful content that we can all agree are not what we want on social media. The live streaming of mass murders like the one in Christchurch, New Zealand, as an example, incitements to violence, as another example. We have to remember the First Amendment doesn't apply here because this isn't a public square. This isn't government censorship. These are private platforms that have every constitutional right to moderate what's on their platforms. The question is, the two questions before us are, where is the line between free and harmful speech, and how should we draw those lines? And I don't have an answer for you on where the line is, other than to say that I can, with existence proofs, point to things that are in the harmful category to prove that there should be a line somewhere. And what I advocate in the book is that we have to first answer the question, who should draw these lines? Where should we draw these lines? And I believe that those lines are best drawn by the most representative and deliberative bodies that we have, which in my mind are the legislatures, the parliaments, the congresses, and in case laws in the courts. And then we can start to debate, where is the appropriate line? What is harmful and what shouldn't be harmful speech? And I think that, incitements to violence are a perfect example of where at least one area where that line should be drawn.
And it's interesting it reminds me a little bit of the whole concept of community standards and the famous Potter Stewart line around pornography, where he said, well, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. And so, I think we're getting to an era where, whether it's legislative in Congress or local or community standards, people have to start entering into the conversation. Another question, Kelsey?
Yep, this one's from Sadish. How can youth get involved in the solutions to quell misinformation?
I think that provides a real challenge and an opportunity, because the youth are much more savvy with this kind of technology. But I also think that we need a lot more digital literacy in our schools in order to enable the youth to be more critical consumers of this kind of technology, because they're more savvy and adept at using the technology. And if we empower them to be more reflective, that they're actually going to change the future of this technology for the better. But we need that education, media literacy, and so on. I cite examples of studies in the book that show that digital media literacy can actually reduce the belief in and sharing of false news. That debate is still ongoing. We still need more research on that, but there are some promising signs that that could be effective. And so I think we need both. I think we need the youth to be engaged, and we need them to be educated and aware and more reflective.
Great answer. I saw someone suggested in the chat when you were talking about the idea of social proof and signaling when it comes to vaccination, that there ought to be a campaign, an I vaccinated campaign. I got vaccinated, just like the, I voted became a way of saying social proof. I better get out there and vote. To your point, that others knowing that other people are getting vaccinated would really help here.
I completely agree. And that's what our research shows, actually.
Well, hey, advertisers on the line, let's figure that one out. I think that's something we ought to do for the good of the world here. You talked a lot about education. I love that last question. How can youth get involved? We want to do our own part for educating folks here. So Kelsey, you want to tell folks, we promised we had a little surprise here. You want to tell folks what our surprise is? Because it fits right in with education.
Absolutely. Perfect segue. So for those of you who may have seen our email marketing or social media marketing, we do have a surprise for you. We're going to draw names for 10 of you to receive Sinan's book. We'll contact you by end of day tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. And we'll be sending that your way. As someone who read the book, it's going to be invaluable in how we move forward with social media. And with all of Sinan's predictions, we mentioned kind of a crystal ball of sorts, what to expect. So if you have any questions, comments, topics for further ideas for our webinar series, feel free to email us at hello@viralgains.com. And thank you all for joining. Thank you so much, Todd and Sinan, for facilitating this conversation.
I want to just wrap up by thanking Sinan for generously giving your time to us for this cause. Truly appreciate it. Not only will 10 of you get the book, but they're actually autographed by Sinan, so I thank him for that as well. The initiative on the digital economy is a phenomenal place at MIT. I would urge folks to follow the research of Sinan and his faculty there if you want to stay current on these issues. So thank you, Sinan. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.